All right, guys. Hey, we're going to do a quick loom. I'm talking about the 18th century Europe. We're going to talk. We're going to introduce, and then I'm going to talk about France. Then I'm going to pause that, and then do another video for Great Britain and the Dutch Republic. So it should be pretty easy peasy. Let's go and get started. Look at the idea to introduce. Remember, the 18th century really for us, it's going to begin in 1715. My reasons for this is in 1713, all of the wars of the previous century, of the 17th century, are brought to an end. We see the balance of power issues are solved, and we're going to have a sense of stability coming into the century. And that's 1713, but by 1715, everything's done. With the death of Louis XIV, the age of absolutism is going to come to an end. The divine right theory is going to be thrown out the window. And you might say, hey, Was, isn't Russia still there until 1721? Yeah, but Russia's Russia. I'm really going to be focused on 1715. Then we're going to see in this chapter, we're going to see the economics. There's going to be a change that we're going to start to see the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. Aristocrat resurgence. Remember, the aristocrat resurgence is there, and we'll talk more about that. But with the death of Louis XIV, the nobility, they're going to try to figure out a way to reclaim their lost privileges. But on the flip side, the same moment, the bourgeoisie is going to begin to try to figure out how to do it with the Enlightenment. And again, we might even throw in 1688, right? 1688, Glorious Revolution. You might say, well, that's still before, but 1688 created a momentum, and the Glorious Revolution really wasn't finished until the death of Queen Anne, because we stabilized that. And Queen died 1714, give or take. So we have that new Hanoverian dynasty. So all aspects of Europe, from all these different regions, they're really going to be stable, and we see that. So that's why I do think the 18th century really begins in 1715. I don't know if that makes sense. You definitely need to know the map. I'm not going to bore us with that. So we're going to start now with France. It's the first Atlantic seaboard state. I want to always remind you, in France, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Really, what we see here, as Louis XIV had really stabilized the absolutism based on the divine right theory, there is no challenge to absolutism. So there's no challenge to absolutism. Louis XV and Louis XVI, they're going to be able to rule whatever way they want. They can either be like their grandfather or great-grandfather, heavily engaged, or they can do whatever they want. And we're going to find out, unfortunately, Louis XV and XVI, they're going to be more about self-gratification rather than for the ruling of the country. Now, with that, I do want to point out, when Louis XV becomes king, right? Baby Louis, there's a sense of hope. The anxiety that Louis XIV had brought, they were hoping is gone. They were hoping to see a new and improved France. Unfortunately, that hope is going to die with the Duke of Orleans. The Duke of Orleans was the regent. And if you identify him, he's going to be there from 1715 to 1723. He dies in 1723. The Duke of Orleans was really about a drunken gambler enjoying that Rococo lifestyle that we've talked about. Rococo, remember, that means flamboyant. It means pleasurable, self-gratification, living large at the expense of the rest of France. And one of his closest friends, John Law, who was a gambling friend of him, he began to say, hey, can you fix our economy? And John Law created this thing called the Mississippi Company. Mississippi Company was given the power from a royal edict, a royal charter. So this was going to be blessed by the government. So what happened was the Mississippi Company was going to organize all the newly developed Mississippi River Valley through the city of New Orleans. They're going to collect tolls. And this was going to systematically organize and tap into the resources of North America. So what they needed capital. So what do? They make a Mississippi Company and allow for investors to invest. Those early investors are called speculators. A speculator buys low, they invest at a low cost, and while that and once they feel that the value of it has maxed out, is when they withdraw. Speculators are more worried about their personal investments than the company overall. And John Law got caught up. He created a mania. The early investors were all the top bourgeois, came in, had tons of capital, and immediately what we see with this chart, we see where it starts out, and then from August, I think this is 1720, from August to December, So we less than right around 6 months. Look at what happened to the value of the share. If you bought it 3,000 lose, by the end of the year, it is now worth 10,000. So you have made you've made 500%, right? Is that 500%? Wow. You have an exponentially claim. So for every $2,000 you put in, you are now able to excrete 10,000. That's an increase of over 8,000 lose. That's a drastic increase. And along the way, people are betting that they're going to continue, they're going to see the same thing, the same investments. So as they invest more and more, these other people, let's say the petty burgers, begin to hope to strike it rich. Well, they would invest their money. Well, once it maxed out, does everybody see this area here? This is where it topped out. And the speculators who invested or were the early investors, they realized there is never going to be a time where this is going to be more than 9,000 lose. Everybody see that? That's called plateauing. That's when the speculators sold, they turned in all their stock, pulled out all of the gold coin, all of the bullion out of the company, and that company is no longer worth anything. So if it's not worth anything, then the stocks now are no longer worth anything. So if I invested at 9,000, now it's worth less than 4,000. I have a significant loss. And they were using the stocks as paper currency. Well, what happens to prices when the currency itself becomes no longer viable? Prices skyrocket. And now people were devastated. They may have been living off this. They thought this was going to be wealth, and now it's worth nothing. Well, unfortunately, these later investors who got swindled, if you will, by the speculators, they looked to John Law and Duke of Orleans and says, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to help us get back our investments? And they said, no, we're going to take a pass. It was your risk. This is really important because as that collapses, by the end of 1923, this 2 or 3 year mania where people really lived high in the hogs, if you will, now all of a sudden there is little hope. They've lost faith in the government. They've lost faith in the economy. And maybe most important, they're going to lose faith in paper currency. They're never going to trust this within these generations, which is going to be devastating. But as we conclude this, I think the Mississippi Company really reflects the Rococo lifestyle, Louis XV and his regents. Duke of Orleans tried to create a moment in which he became really famous and really wealthy at the expense of France. Now in 1723, he does die. Cardinal Fleury comes in and he is going to be the chief minister from 1720 to 1743. Out of all of this chaos, he does balance the royal budget. That means for the first time ever, the king spent less than they took out in taxes. That's a really good moment because now they can begin to pay off that debt of Louis XIV and Louis XV. That seems like a good thing. Unfortunately, in 1740, this Cardinal Fleury's policy of trying to maintain peace failed. France got sucked into that War of Austrian Succession that I hope you're reading about tonight. And when France gets involved, no longer do they have a balanced budget. So therefore, all of the hard work Cardinal Fleury did was out the window, and France continued to increase debt. He dies in 1743, and the hope of the Bourbon Franks really collapses with him. Because from 1743 to 1774, Louis XV ruled, has these years of self-rule. And again, it seems like a cool thing. If we go back to our power map from the previous couple chapters ago, remember Louis XIV, when he declared himself to self-rule, his mother laughed at him, but he ended up being a really efficient ruler. We may not like him. We think he's pretty harsh, but in the end, he does manage his country well. Unfortunately, Louis XV is nothing like his great-grandfather. He was more interested in his sexual escapades and his Versailles gossip. Madame Pompadour is a great P3 here. She was the chief mistress in the 1740s to Louis XV. Louis XV did not want to have Diderot's encyclopedia published because it challenged the tenets of absolutism, French Catholicism, mercantilism, and the social class system. So his censor said we shouldn't print this. This would create too many ideas, create too much chaos. So he was cool until Madame Pompadour basically said, you aren't going to have sex with me until you allow it to be published. His desire for his sexual activity with Madame Pompadour was more important than the stability of his country, and the encyclopedia does get published, and those ideas begin to siphon out. During that time period, he may have been asked, what about the state of France? What are you doing to help France stay stabilized? And instead of him coming up with a game plan, he said, it will survive my time. So his lifetime, France is me fine. But after him, they deluge. Remember, the word deluge is a destructive rain. And what we see here, it will survive my time after me, the deluge. It's almost as if he's predicting the French Revolution. He realizes that his policies are only good about today, and then in the future, they will be devastating. So the state of absolutism, absolutely corrupt. And what we see here, it's the richest country with the poorest government. And what that means is, number one, France has the most resources. Remember the bourgeoisie, they have the mercantiles, they have all this infrastructure, all these resources. France has an opportunity to move forward progressively. But the government was the opposite of that. The government did not have taxable income, and they outspent themselves. So they were always going to be the poorest government. There's a problem with that. I'll let you ponder through that. Now, when Louis XV died, there was a glimmer of hope. Louis XVI becomes king. He marries Marie Antoinette, who I will tell you is not a very popular queen. They did call her the quote unquote German bitch because she was from Austria. And we'll see that today, kind of what that looks like maybe. But Marie Antoinette, she's going to be the blame. But the glimmer of hope occurs right in 1774. Louis XVI appears to be enlightened, that he is about to embrace enlightened absolutism. How does he do that? He appointed Jacques Turgot, a physiocrat, to be the Minister of Finances. He was going to create this long-term transition from mercantilism to capitalism. He increased the land tax, which ticked off the nobility, and he began to create a laissez-faire approach. Well, I will tell you, it's going to take a long time for this transition because instead of the government telling the people what to produce, it was going to be the marketplace. And it was going to be a long metamorphosis. Most historians say it's probably take about 20 years for the process to become complete. Unfortunately, because the nobility didn't like Jacques Turgot and his attack on their privilege, they forced Louis XVI, bullied him into firing him only after 18 months. So I want to point out the physiocrat gave hope to the philosophers of Paris, the philosophic reformers. They really believed they were on the precipice, if you will, of that progress. Remember, Condorcet is about to write his book on the age of progress. Holbach's talking about the systems of nature. Rousseau is talking about the social contract. This was the moment in which people believed that Louis XVI was going to usher in this progress. But after 18 months, he slammed the door and he went back to his traditional practices. So I do think it's really important that you see that. And at the end, he loved Versailles and his personal endeavors. He loved putting clocks together. So instead of ruling France with the principles of the Enlightenment, he did the exact same thing that his grandfather, Louis XV. And at the outcome, we're going to see that these two people will be missing their head within 20 years. And we'll talk about that later. Now, I hope that makes sense. I hope that kind of helps you out with that. I'm going to finish through that. I'm going to stop this video. It's going to take a second because I get over here. We're going to stop.